Welcome to the University of Edinburgh. My name is Grant Jarvie. I'm Chair of Sport, member of the School of Education, Institute of Sport, Physical Education and Health Science, Director of the Academy of Sport. So welcome to the University of Edinburgh, welcome to the School of Education, welcome to the Academy of Sport, welcome to the Institute of Sport, Physical Education and Health Science. And I don't think I've missed anything out there, but we are being filmed, so that's primarily because these talks are shared with the University of Toronto, who we're a partner with, so welcome to the University of Toronto for this session. It is a great pleasure to introduce Sir Craig Reedie to you, and Craig won't need much introduction for those in the sports field, but I'm just going to say a few words for those of you from a wide range of different countries in this room who may or may not know who Sir Craig is. But we're really fortunate to have him here for about an hour. He's happy to take questions on a broad range of issues after a smallish introduction round about his work with WADA, World Anti-Doping Agency, of which he is president, and also Olympic issues as a vice president of the International Olympic Committee. There are many countries, indeed many of the countries represented in this room, who often try to work out how many top-flight sports administrators their country should have. Denmark once worked out that for a population size of about 5 million people, they thought they should have 12 people working on the world stage in terms of prestige and influence. But whatever you think about that, we certainly have one of these top-flight international sports administrators with us this afternoon. I could say a lot about Craig. Born in Stirling, educated first and foremost University of Glasgow, that other university on the west coast, but Scotland's an international place, so we work very closely with the University of Glasgow and other places. Professional career as a financial advisor, involved in badminton at a high level, president of the International Badminton Federation from 1981 to 1984. In 1992 he became chairman of the British Olympic Federation. He's been a member of the International Olympic Committee since 1994. He was a board member of the London 2012 Olympic Organisation Committee. In 2013, he was elected president of the World Anti-Doping Agency, but he's been with that agency, working with that agency since 1999. Craig's work contributed to a vast range of issues. He's been recognised by a number of authorities, a range of honorary degrees, CBE, OBE, knighted as Sir Craig Reedie in 2006, and it's a real pleasure to have him with you. A man of high integrity, kept his word in terms of coming here. We've been talking about this talk for a while, but definitely kept his word to the University of Edinburgh in terms of coming along this afternoon.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to be with you. This School of Sport is well known, and clearly it's a very international organisation from the mix of people we have in the audience. Grant asked me to do this to talk about the work of WADA, the current state of play. But funnily enough, in the anti-doping world, in common with everything else, things change pretty rapidly, and they've been changing very rapidly over the last few months. And every time we got in touch, he actually changed something as well and said, by the way, would you add on a little bit about things you do for the Olympics and whatever. So here we go. I mean, let's do the anti-doping bit first. I mean, it's easy to forget that until 16 years ago, there wasn't any one agency which dealt with and produced a simple answer to the problems of tackling doping in sport. There was no World Anti-Doping Agency. The anti-doping industry, and believe you me, it is now an industry, became about, and WADA came about, I think, as a result of a serious crisis that engulfed sport in the late 1990s. Probably two crises, if I'm honest. The first was the Festina controversy. Those of you who have a cycling background will remember the raid by French authorities on the 1999 Tour de France, 1998 Tour de France, when they found a whole mass of banned substances caught by the police, and riders and coaches were arrested. And the second, I suppose, was what became known as the Salt Lake City scandal, involving the IOC, when we had difficulties with the awarding of the Winter Games to Salt Lake City in the United States. And that resulted in the suspension of a number of our members. So I think these two really questioned the values of sport. And the world, I think, had come to love the values of sport and to cherish them, and these were being threatened. And it was doping, above all, I think, which really sparked this off. So WADA was formed in 1999 at the first World Conference on Doping in Sport. Representing the sport movement, the IOC invited governments to come to a conference in Lausanne. And boy, did governments turn up. Initially, they weren't all that interested in anti-doping. They wanted to kick the IOC. But once they'd finished that and they got on to the real purpose of the exercise, we ended up with the establishment of an international independent agency to combat doping in sport. We started operating later that year, and we are a fairly unique 50-50 partnership between sport and governments. The IOC, representing sport, produces 50% of our revenues, and the governments of the world meet the other half. And governments themselves decide who will pay what and from where and whatever amount. We don't interfere with that. But this 50-50 split is also representative on the composition of our various committees, our executive committee and the foundation board. Foundation board is 34 strong, 17 from sport and 17 from governments. Following the very first draft of the World Anti-Doping Code, which was the first set of globally consistent anti-doping rules, and these were put in front of everybody in Copenhagen, the second World Conference in 2003. They took effect just before the 2004 Olympic and Paralympic Games. The principal, I suppose, object of that code was to try to harmonise sanctions. So that if you were an athlete and you took a banned substance, you were sanctioned for the same amount of time, no matter what sport you were involved in. That was difficult to do. Two sports were very reluctant to sign up to that. One was cycling and the second was football, soccer, as opposed to American football. But at the end of the day, they both came to the party and signed up. Governments can't actually just accept a declaration taken at a sports conference. They need to have a properly established legal basis for action. And their commitment to recognise the code came in the form of a UNESCO convention, the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport, which was written in record time. Actually, it was the fastest ever UNESCO convention in 2005. It celebrated its 10th anniversary last year at the Conference of Parties in Paris, and it's now been ratified by 182 countries, which reflect 98% of the world's population. Now, this unique partnership between government and the sport movement is what helps the anti-doping community protect the values of sport. Values-led sport is what clean athletes and the public at large desire. So it's worth actually just for a moment, Grant, if I may, to talk about values. Values remain as important to sport today as they have always been. When today's win-at-all-costs culture continues to threaten sport, the public and a vast majority of athletes value the importance of fair play, as they always have. Despite this win-at-all-costs culture, which encourages athletes to take shortcuts, enticing them with more money and with the entourage persuading the athlete to break the rules so that the support person, his coach or his doctor or his agent, can also benefit from the athlete's success. There is a huge amount of temptation for athletes to cut corners. The public, I think, continue to be disgusted by cheating. One might even say that in the light of recent doping scandals, there are signs of doping fatigue amongst the public. So it's our responsibility in the anti-doping community to retain public and athlete confidence through a robust anti-doping system led by strong values. Values such as fair play, a respect for your opponent and the officials, healthy regard for the rules of sport, honesty over dishonesty, ethical behaviour from athletes, doing what is right. Ethics in sport help us to distinguish what is right from what is wrong. I was going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think integrity is really important and values are really important. So I think I'll move on, if I may, and to tell you what we have tried to do to reinforce these values. For years, anti-doping was seen as a negative issue. We were always fighting the war against doping. It was a battle between cat and mouse, the good versus the bad guys. Yet today it's more apparent that we're doing an anti-doping in sport. That what we're doing is not fighting a war, which is negative. We're trying to be positive, and that is that we are protecting the clean athlete. This is our raison d'etre, to ensure that clean athletes have the opportunity to compete on a level playing field. The clean athletes, funnily enough, are the overwhelming majority. And the overwhelming majority does not want to get down on the starting line in 100 metres and know that there are 2 of the 9 athletes who are cheating. Today, under the improved rules of the revised World Anti-Doping Code, the code is a living document. It tends to get revised once every 6 years. The most recent version came into effect on 1st of January 2015. We are able to protect the clean athlete, I think, like never before. We have abilities now to test athletes for the right substance at the right time. We have rules that better recognise that rarely does an athlete dope alone, but more often doping is the result of the entourage encouraging athletes to make these bad decisions. If I digress slightly, I think the proof of one of or two of the recent issues is if you happen to be a young, talented marathon runner from Kenya and you win one of the big worldwide marathon races, you win a prize of roughly £500,000. Now, if you think about it in these terms, and I'm not complaining that this happens, but I understand that the risk then exists, that unscrupulous agents, unscrupulous coaches, unscrupulous advisors have a different interest in assisting that athlete to win prizes of that magnitude. So that's why we believe that very few athletes actually dope on their own. There is almost always somebody, sometimes it's a friend who offers friendly advice and they get it wrong, and that's not particularly helpful either. We're always increasing and improving our research, both in science and also in social science, so we're able to better understand why an athlete wants to dope. We have an enhanced compliance program so that high-quality anti-doping programs, we hope, will be in place in every part of the world. So we don't want people and our stakeholders just to be compliant because they've got the right rules. We then want them not only they have to apply these rules properly, but we want them to have highly competent and well-organized and efficient anti-doping systems. We run outreach and education initiatives that promote values-based education so that the athletes of tomorrow are prevented from doping. And next Wednesday I'm going to the Olympic Youth Games in Lillehammer, and in the canteen, the feeding area, there is always a stand run by WADA, and athletes come and take a computerised test. It's fairly straightforward, 10 questions, and if they get it right, they get a prize, which is normally some absolutely obscene hat, or the last one was a horrible green watch. We had a bit of problem there because we had a watch contract for the games. They were unhappy that we were handing out these horrible things to the athletes, but it takes a trick. And it's amazing the number of people, athletes, who come and learn, and then they sign formally the great big screen, which is in favour of clean sport. So our outreach programmes are really very successful. And we also pay much attention at the moment to the development at the elite end of the athlete's biological passport. This is a system whereby blood profiles are taken regularly from athletes, so you pick up a longitudinal profile of the behaviour of that athlete. So if then there is a blip in the system and you know that something appears to have gone wrong, you can then test. So the potential is there for anti-doping to make greater progress than ever before. But for that to happen, we also require good practice from our athletes, from our anti-doping partners worldwide. And we require the athletes to play their part as well. Our expectations of athletes are that they make use of the systems available to them. If athletes are aware of doping behaviour, then they can report it in any of the tip-off lines or whistleblowing lines that are available both in WADA and in many of our partners. Athletes have a responsibility now under the new code to avoid association with banned support personnel, as is required through the new prohibited association rules in the code. And we have published our first list of prohibited coaches or doctors or whoever. Funnily enough, many of them are Italian, and that's because doping is a criminal offence in Italy. So the data is there and the information is there. And although it is a criminal offence in Italy, the Italian authorities have never once applied a criminal sanction to an athlete. They're after coaches, they're after doctors, they're after people who are trading and dealing in substances. And athletes also have responsibilities to complete a system known as their whereabouts. I used to be treasurer of WADA and spent an enormous amount of money on IT programs. I'll go to my grave with IT on my forehead. But it's now down to an app or on your mobile phone, and you can tell the people who are responsible for you where you are for 1 hour a day. Now, when we introduced this, there was a storm of protests from the athletes, and we pointed out to them that the previous rules, we could test them anywhere, 24 hours a day. So although they actually had to do something, this was actually a better system than it was before. I can remember quite a happy discussion with Andy Murray on that particular subject, and he got the message. And that's important, because if the system is to work, we actually need to know where people are. And it's not too much to ask now in a technological world, just to fill in the details and send it off. So all of this is important if the system is to work in the athlete's best interest. So we'll hear more today about other ethics and sport issues, such as match fixing, illegal betting, corruption and fraud. In fact, sport has been on not just the back pages of our newspapers this year, but the front pages as well. Rather than seeing these other integrity issues as competing with doping for media space or television airtime, we must instead see these as values-based matters. They are all issues that threaten sport as we know it, and we must all row in the same direction of to combat these problems effectively. To coin a frequently used politician's phrase, we are actually all in this together. There's no doubt, however, that doping is still a very major issue. In terms of its importance, as an ethics in sport issue. Doping, like no other issue, hits athletes where it hurts, at their one shot of glory, at their own opportunity of a gold medal. And that is why we must work together to protect the clean athletes. Now, the anti-doping world has been forced into the media limelight over recent months. In December 2014, ARD, the German television station, and, would you believe, its full-time doping investigatory unit, published a series of 3 television programs with allegations of serious doping offences in Russia. The reaction was instant and from many different countries. As WADA president, I decided to establish an independent commission to investigate these allegations. And the reason it was an independent commission was if we tried to do it ourselves in a structure which is 50% sport and 50% governments, inevitably you will lead yourself into political difficulties. If you put an independent group in place to do this, then you have a chance of having it done properly. The commission was chaired by a colleague of mine, Dick Pound, who was the first president of WADA, helped by Richard McLaren, a Canadian lawyer with long doping arbitration experience, and Gunther Younger, a professional investigator from Germany. And I think it's just worth looking at the terms of reference for that commission. And these were to investigate the validity of allegations of doping practices, corrupt practices around sample collection and results management, and other ineffective administration of anti-doping processes that implicate Russia, the IWF, athletes, coaches, trainers, doctors, and other members of athletes' entourages, as well as the accredited laboratory based in Moscow and the Russian anti-doping agency, or RUSADA. In other words, an investigation linked to Russia and the sport of athletics. That was what they were asked to do. It won't surprise you to know that the world thinks they should now investigate everything else in every other sport in every other country. But that was those were their terms of reference, and that's what they were commissioned to do. Now, it's now well known that the Commission found a whole range of breaches of the World Anti-Doping Code and the associated international standards. The report, which was published in November last year, the first part, reveals a systematic level of doping involving athletes, their entourages, RUSADA, the Moscow laboratory, and the IWF. The almost instant reaction from WADA was as follows: to temporarily suspend the Moscow laboratory and to encourage the director to be fired. In fact, he resigned almost within minutes. We requested the IWF, which we have the right to do under the code, to declare its member national organisation, the All-Russian Athletics Association, to be non-compliant, and the IWF did that. And we ourselves, having sought further information from the Russian ministry, declared RUSADA to be non-compliant. Now, the report also indicated that behaviour of a criminal nature had been discovered, and as the Independent Commission had no powers to deal with criminal issues, these had been referred to Interpol, who had subsequently passed them to the French police authorities. And for those of you who know and have lived in France, you will probably know that anything of any interest in France tends to be in the media within minutes. So there's been quite a lot of public knowledge on the information that was passed to the French police. Now, I extended the remit of the Independent Commission in August of 2015, last year, to examine a further programme on allegations by ARD, and this time also involving the Sunday Times, dealing with a substantial database of blood readings leaked from the IWF, and further allegations that the IWF had not dealt with the correct follow-up to these blood readings. This, if you remember, was around the time of the World Athletics Championships in Beijing, the election of a new president of the IWF, and it was a mess. And I take the view that WADA helped the IAAF by saying, okay, we will take your issues on that particular area of activity into our commission and we will examine them properly. The second report from the Commission was delivered on the 14th of January this year. That's when I made my crack about the sun in California. I got landed on a plane at Heathrow at 3:15, which was 1 hour after the press conference, so it was held by the Commission in Munich, and I switched on my mobile phone and I had 27 messages, almost all of them from the BBC, I have to say. Welcome home, Craig. So the 14th of January, this I will always remember. And that part of our report on this occasion disclosed the criminal behaviour by the former President, Treasurer and anti-doping manager of the IAAF, along with the consultant legal advisor to the President and the President's two sons. The allegations being investigated by the French police covered attempted extortion of large sums of money from athletes to make positive tests disappear. This second report also dealt with the issues of the allegations that the blood readings in the database indicated that athletes were doping. I'm delighted to say that this was substantially refuted, and the IAAF were declared to have been competent in their duties to follow up any suspicious blood readings. Now, as you might imagine, all of this made enormous media headlines all around the world, as the second report covered the criminal issues. And for both delivery of both sections of the report created a firestorm, the like of which I haven't experienced. When added to the previous exposures of corruption in football with FIFA, this whole issue brought sport into serious challenge from media everywhere. In our country, there was also much public criticism of the newly elected president of the IAAF, Sebastian Coe, involving public meetings of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Parliamentary Select Committee. WADA set up the independent commission, so we've been relatively unaffected by the media criticism. However, as our job is not to punish people, but to make them compliant, we've been working with the Russian Sports Ministry to develop a roadmap of actions that need to be taken to make RUSADA compliant. I await, literally day by day, a report from the disciplinary committee who will report on the Moscow laboratory, on whether the laboratory should be completely closed down and re-accredited, or whether the errors in the laboratory were personality driven and they're not there anymore. And that's actually quite an important thing. And the IAAF themselves, because they have to look after their own national federation, the Russian Athletics Federation, and they have their own working group to deal with ARAF, they're called. So much work needs to be done, but any relaxation of suspensions is entirely in the hands of the Russian authorities. It is up to them to clean their house and to make it possible that the organisations can be declared to be compliant. And they are painfully and regularly aware of this. Now, the other body with close interest in proceedings is the International Olympic Committee, as their decision to host the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro looms close. The IOC is committed to have the whole world taking part in Olympic Games. We actually impose in the Olympic Charter an obligation on every national Olympic committee to attend the Olympic Games, but only if they are compliant with the World Anti-Doping Code. If you remember, Russia in Sochi were hosts of the 2014 Olympic Winter Games. So you can imagine current concern that Russia and its athletics team are in doubt of appearing in Rio in August. And let me make it quite clear, it is not my job to invite Russia to the Olympic Games. My job is to try to get the Russian anti-doping agency to be compliant. The IOC is the senior sports body in world sport. And its executive board is a sort of cabinet of world sport with a whole range of issues to deal with. We're based in Lausanne in Switzerland, and we now have a staff of around 420 people. So it's not a small organisation. And another 120 in Olympic Broadcasting Services, whose base is in Madrid. So instead of asking national broadcasters to televise the games for us, we have our own people who go in, and we are the host broadcaster, and we provide the pictures for the rest of the world to take in whatever alliance that they choose to take. I'm not unhappy to see yesterday's announcement that BBC and Discovery, the American channel who now own European rights, have at last reached agreement so that there will be a very large amount of free-to-air coverage of 18, 20, 22 and 24 on the BBC. I suppose the summit of our operations is the selection of host cities and then the 7 years of coordination with that city before they host the games. Wearing my British Olympic hat, I actually spent 19 and a half years from beginning to end on the very successful London Games. I actually chaired the National Olympic Committee, which decided that if we bid again, we'd bid with London. And then 19 and a half years later, that was a meeting where we signed off and wound up the company and passed about £1 million to a bunch of London lawyers just in case something went wrong. So it can be a long-term exercise. So in that sense, I fully understand the challenges that currently face Rio. When they bid for the Games, and they were awarded the Games in 2009, Rio and Brazil were enjoying a political and economic period in the sun. Since then, their political situation has changed dramatically. Their economy has been hugely damaged. Their currency is rapidly devaluing, and they have suffered much criticism for the excessive costs they undertook to run the 2014 World Football Cup. Their Olympic Games, I have to say, will be a fairly Spartan affair. But the people in Rio have an infectious sense of fun, and provided we and they get conditions right for the athletes of the world as a priority, then I think the Games will pass off successfully. We shall see. So the world of sport's an interesting world, but one which can offer, when its competitions are organised and promoted well, some of the most memorable moments in people's lives. Just think back to the glories of the summer of 2012, when the whole of Britain became swept up in Olympic glory. And just look at the transformation the Games brought about in East London. We rebuilt one of the most deprived parts of our capital city. Westfield then built the biggest shopping centre in Europe beside the Olympic Park, and that wouldn't have happened had we not won the right to host the Games. So you look at the transformation that can happen in the city, and that's the easy bit, because that's the physical legacy. The other legacies, which are ongoing support and encouragement of sport, are really much more difficult to deliver. Too many people think it's the obligation of the organising committee. It isn't. My job and Seb Coe's job was to run the Games, not to look after sport in this country for the next 25 years. But even when the days are dark with doping and match-fixing issues, I think we should remember that good can always be apparent and survive.
My question, you mentioned American football really briefly, and obviously the NFL kind of operates quite independently, and occasionally, well, quite recently, they have numerous scandals in and out. So how does WADA cooperate with them when they kind of want to run their own things and instill their own suspensions and punishments and things like that?
Some of the stuff you were saying at the start suggests there's a sort of black and white, good versus bad argument going on here, but of course there's always the grey area in between, and one of the areas we discuss with our students a lot is performance nutrition. And obviously with the prohibited list that exists, it's updated all the time to try and catch some of those grey areas. But we know of a number of nutritional supplements which are shown to benefit performance, but are not deemed to contravene the spirit of sport. So it's just a question there about who decides and how do they decide, which substances go on the ban list and which ones don't.
My question is more to do with the Olympic side rather than the WADA side. I just wanted to know, in your opinion, why sports like sport climbing and skateboarding went ahead of squash in the 2024 Olympics?
It's not just the NFL. We have a real problem with the American professional leagues. It includes golf, hockey. This is going to the University of Toronto. That's ice hockey as opposed to field hockey. Baseball have been making major steps, and to a certain extent basketball. They choose not to adopt the WADA code. They are not signatories to the WADA code. We speak to them constantly, and we are making progress. It's actually quite difficult for an international organisation like WADA to understand that, for example, the introduction of a test for human growth hormone in National Football League is a matter of union salary negotiation. It's the only part of the world where that kind of thing happens. So we're working at it. You have to remember too that although you get big crowds to watch the matches in London, there's really only one country in the world where they have the Super Bowl and you become world champions. I mean, it's only American teams that can enter and compete. So it's not an international sport in the sense that, for example, swimming, basketball, soccer, taekwondo, athletics would be. We're making progress. There's been significant programs with baseball. They saw the error of their ways, and they've made major steps, and we encourage them to do that. In golf, now that they are becoming an Olympic sport, the American players who get onto the short list, or maybe even the long list, to be selected for the United States team will be subject to doping under Olympic regulations and not just under the PGA Tour. So it's a sort of softly catchy monkey approach, and it takes longer than I wish that it would. The difficult question, the list, who does the list is easy. We have a list committee of really expert people. They actually met for next year's list last week in Montreal. So this is a sort of 50-week process to get it right. We submit the possible changes halfway through the year, and we get inundated with suggestions from national anti-doping organisations and scientists all around the world. And then the list committee come to the executive board of WADA, and we approve a list. Nutritional supplements are a real issue because in most parts of the world they're an unregulated business. There isn't, it's not, America's got the Drugs and Food Administration, where there is regulation of the product. That doesn't happen with substances. There are some universities, there's one in Germany, in Cologne, I think it's the laboratory there, which has done some analysis and has said, we think these are safe, and I think that's helpful. But we do not have powers, and nor in many ways are we prepared to take the legal risk of saying that this substance is okay when it could well be that the products that go into that substance almost naturally change in character and we end up with a positive test. I mean, those of you who know anything about the American legal system will know that I think half the lawyers in the world live in America, and that's why it's a very litigious country. So there is no, there's no one, and there are very few national authorities, and there's no one world authority which will state whether substances are clean or not. We advise people take substances with extreme care. If in doubt, don't. And there is a school of thought among the doctors who say you shouldn't do it anyway. I'll leave the doctors and the scientists to organise that. New sports in 2024. The IOC have had a progression for years of trying to change the summer programme. The winter programme is easy because there aren't all that many athletes 2,300, 2,400. There's normally plenty space, and you can build in new events or sometimes build in new sports. Curling, for example, is a relatively new Winter Olympic sport. Summer games are difficult, and change of the programme has almost always been, from the IOC's point of view, that we had to remove a sport from the programme to let another sport come in. And that's a very disruptive thing to do, because you're telling somebody whom you know and like, I'm sorry, we don't want you anymore. So under a reform programme called Agenda 2020, we've gone on to an event-based programme as opposed to a sports-based programme. And I'm not entirely happy that we have sort of handed some of the bureaucracy of this over to the host city for 2020. So they have examined, I think it was a range of about 14 different sports, and they've come up with 6 or 7 that they would like to see as an addition to the programme. Karate is a big sport, and they like the contact sports. Squash didn't make the cut, and I think that's a shame, because I think squash, although I'm a racket sportsman, I think squash has made a very reasonable case, but clearly it's not a major sport in Japan. So to an extent, we're now faced with a selected list, which is sort of biased slightly into the likes of a host city. We have still to accept that. We have a meeting in March and another one in June, and then it goes to our full annual general meeting in July. I question whether we want to have 6 or 7 sports which could be in the games for only one occasion. So you end up with 7 Olympic gold medalists who might never be back in the games again. I think there are wider issues in this. But going forward, it is going to be event-based. So it's not all of the events in the sports that we've been talking about. Karate, for example, has any number of different events, and they're only bringing 2 or 3. So I'm not all that happy with the process, but we're only halfway through it.
In terms of, thank you for a very good explanation, and students in the room, we've done Greenmost analysis, you've done some postal analysis, some key stakeholder work there. In terms of critical success factors and your key performance indicators, and again, you don't want to be too controversial, but there's, as you know, a lot of critique in the press about literally being upstairs taking affairs, whilst there's been, a considerably long period with which WADA and the IOC have only ever made incremental changes to their structures and their cultures, and are sort of tinkering around the edges. Do you think there is at any point, given the current crisis, that there should be some really radical changes to the international organisations that the public perceives is actually being fairly ineffective for some considerable period of time?
You said that we know that a lot of athletes who are using banned substances aren't using them on their own. They're pressured into it through trainers or coaches and that sort of thing. So does WADA offer any programming or support to help athletes report those people or find different support or different coaching and that sort of thing?
And I would like to know, from the WADA point of view, the Olympics will be hosted in Brazil, which is a country that doesn't really have a doping control. Not to say that it's non-existent, but it's not exactly well done. I know athletes that have been more than 3 years without being tested. So I would like to know how WADA feels about this sort of work that has been done in some countries. I would say that Brazil is the only one, but some countries have that issue. So how does WADA feel about that?
The whole question of organisation and standards and governance, this has been brought absolutely to the fore over the last year. First of all, by the football organisation, by FIFA, where their abuses in the main were financial, and then the IAAF, where the abuses in some ways are worse than that, because they do, on this occasion, actually affect the results on the field of play. You know, the fact that somebody in a Caribbean country is pocketing ticket money that he shouldn't doesn't affect the results of that particular match. FIFA are going through agonies of how they resolve their issues. I think it's the 26th in Zurich, this month in Zurich. I'm actually getting to go to watch with interest. And I'm not entirely sure what they're going to come up with. In FIFA's case, I think the base problem has been a governance situation where their international organisation is effectively controlled by people who owe loyalties to the regional confederations the whole way around the world. So there isn't proper international governance in FIFA, and it will be interesting to see exactly what they do to resolve that. As far as the IOC is concerned, as soon as the FIFA storm broke, I mean, we got really concerned. And we've tried to adopt and insist for all of the Olympic movement that they will adopt the principles of good governance in everything they do. We now account publicly for our finances differently. We produce a very complex annual report which tells everybody what we do from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, everything we're trying to do, what we're achieving, what we're not achieving. It's a very public document. International sports federations are actually independent contractors. We can't force them to, but we're leading them by example, and all the international federations are trying to do that as well. As far as WADA is concerned, I think that the supervision that sport has in WADA from our government partners is pretty intense. We have to be very open, we have to be very transparent, we have to run our affairs with proper governance. Otherwise our public authority partners wouldn't live with us. But any sports organisation who believes that they can just carry on without change at the moment is probably living in the cloud cuckoo land. Everybody needs to sit down and work, and it's pretty horrible that one of the major Olympic sports produces evidence that at the very top of that sport was a group of people who were behaving in ways that are just completely unacceptable. So this is a salutary lesson that when you look at your KPIs, you better make sure that you keep them up to date and that you regularly deliver on them and state that you have. Question of athletes doping on their own, what do we do about it? First of all, we've threatened under the new code to avoid prohibited association. We actually have quite a lot of evidence in this that the entourage around an athlete is all important. And sometimes there's a friend, I wish I could remember her name, she was a German either long-distance skier or biathlete in Sochi. And one of her friends said, I've come across a new health drink here, would you like to try that? This girl had won 2 Olympic gold medals. So she said, yes, thanks very much. And she's now banned for 3 or 4 years. So it's a question, as far as the athletes are concerned, it is a question of education. And we have a whole range of education material, from base material right at the bottom end, right through to pretty sophisticated stuff, web-based, a project called Alpha. So we encourage athletes to check and look at that. And we have always imposed higher sanctions on the entourage rather than the athlete themselves. But it's a struggle. And Brazil, that's a loaded question. The Brazilian system has not been good. The Brazilian laboratory lost its accreditation 2 years ago. and it's taken almost 2 years to get it re-established. It's amazing what can be done in a country if you're hosting the Olympic Games, I have to say. That happened in London. We got all sorts of things done because we were hosting the Games. So to that extent, the laboratory is fully functional and is big enough to do the volume of testing that will be demanded of it at both the Olympic and the Paralympic Games. It will then become a science department of one of Rio's universities. So there's a legacy for it. As far as the doping systems are concerned, the National Anti-Doping Organization in Brazil, which funny enough is ABCD, my Portuguese is very limited, but that's what it's called, ABCD, has not been the most efficient, that's for sure. And we're trying to do that. They have not had code-compliant rules, and they don't have yet. And they have to have them by the 18th of March this year, otherwise they will be declared non-compliant. Now that's not going to be good news for anybody who's keen on promoting sport in Brazil. In fact, we can in fact resolve the problem, because funnily enough, at Olympic Games, all of the doping work is done by the IOC. It's not done by WADA. So we will have to arrange that the IOC arranges testing, particularly of Brazilian athletes, between whenever it is in March and the opening ceremony. We do in any way assist the IOC in putting together intelligence on where we think target testing should take place in the run-up to the Games. That happened in London, and it happened very successfully. So I think there's about 35 or 36 athletes didn't get to London at all because they were sanctioned, and very few people caused us problems during the Games in London. And we want to replicate that for Brazil. But it's not the perfect solution. And the problem, you come from Brazil, you know how difficult it is to get your politicians to do anything. If you've got any bright ideas, I'll give you a card and you can send me the answers, or the name of somebody who might be able to do it.
From your last point there, in terms of sports from countries who do not really subscribe to the WADA code and program, I've read before in the papers on previous Olympic Games, for example, that some NBA basketball players from the States that were participating in some Olympic Games were trying to get a deal to be exempt from any testing. So what happens with such athletes when they get to the Olympic Games? And does the testing for those athletes extend beyond the Olympics? You mentioned a very good practice there in terms of stopping them from getting to the Olympic Games, but do you have any authority or any power to test such athletes if they don't subscribe to the WADA program?
Does the IAAF have the right man in charge leading it forward?
My main question, the power sport is not really important as those elite sports for the able body.
And after the scandal of Russia, and someone suggested that the world record needs to be reset because some of the world records may be created by those athletes who have some doping programs, and for example, and some world records are. It has been a long time for some world records are not broken. And for example, the women 400 meters straight, and it has been more than 15 years. Nobody can break that world record. So in your opinion, do you think the receive the world record is good for anti-doping, and it can be a great begin in terms of anti-doping?
Okay, countries that don't subscribe to the code, there are any number of small countries in the world who may have economic problems or social or organising problems in which anti-doping is not absolutely their priority. We try to deal with that by creating regional anti-doping organisations. I think we've got 16 RAROs which cover 123 countries. So actually we try to help them on the ground with the issues that they have. If top-end programs like basketball players, if they're coming to games, they're exactly in the same position that the golfers will be. In the build-up to the game, the dream team from America will be tested under Olympic regulations, not under NBA regulations, up to, during and through the games. And for the life of me, I can't remember any elite American basketball player testing positive in the build-up to or during a game. So I can only assume that the higher pressures and the higher standards actually work. I said in an interview the other day that it's not up to the president of WADA to talk about who is the president of an international sports federation. And I then said, but personally I have to answer that question. I've worked with Seb Coe for years before on the build-up to and during the London Games. I think he is absolutely the correct person to do the work that is necessary under the IWF for a number of reasons. It's in his blood, if you don't mind me saying that at an anti-doping meeting. Athletics is in his blood. Secondly, he is very media experienced. In fact, he's a lot more media experienced than he was before. He's very smart and he's very good. And above all, he fought an election in August last year, where the 224 athletics federations from all around the world elected him to do this. We have a habit in this country of, if we have an opportunity, we will criticise our heroes and our icons. And he knows that, and I think he regrets the remark that this was a declaration of war on his sport. People forget that he was in the middle of an election at that stage rather than just talking about the British media. So I think he will do fine. This is a tough job because outsiders, the Independent Commission and the French police, will root out the criminal problems. Russia will have to come into line, and then it will be up to Seb and the IWF to make sure that their whole standards, he's talking about an integrity commission within the IWF, he's talking about doubling the anti-doping budget, he's making all the right noises. He was elected to do that, and I'm sure at the moment he's the right person. Whether he lasts 16 years like the previous president, I don't know, and I haven't asked him, but he's a good guy. We take Paralympic sport on exactly the same basis in WADA as we take able-bodied sport. So to that extent, there is no difference. It will be the International Paralympic Committee who will be responsible during the Paralympic Games, as the way that the IOC is responsible during the Olympic Games. Your comment about doping control officers, I do take on board. Because sometimes they aren't as good as they should be. And there is a whole procedure. They need to be educated. The chaperones who collect the athletes need to be educated. This is important. Frequently, if it's done on an in-competition basis, I mean, the athlete might just have won a gold medal and is whipped away. You have to do that properly, under a proper set of rules, so that the athlete's rights are protected. In the same way, it's never as public if it's an out-of-competition test. I mean, if I knock on your door at 10 o'clock in the morning and you're tested then, nobody will know except you. But doping control officers need to be properly trained. World records. This has become very popular because Ed Warner, the president of UK Athletics, wants to start a debate. Now, the one way to start a debate is to say, I'm going to change all the world records. It was immediately Jonathan Edwards, Paula Radcliffe, and somebody else, I can't remember, immediately said, oh no, you won't, because you're changing mine. So he got his debate going here. I think it's actually quite difficult to completely rewrite history. I think you have to accept that history is what it is, and then you have to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
I was wondering, in your opinion, what you feel the legacy of the London 2012 Olympics is? Concerning doping, you said that there are criminal sanctions to coaches and doctors, but no criminal sanctions to athletes, which is kind of strange to me because I think that the people actually taking the drugs should be punished. So do you think that the athletes should be given criminal sanctions, and why or why not?
Regarding London,
2012?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the next Olympics as well?
Okay.
What will be the latest?
If you're going to, and the IOC now recognised that it needed to change its system of awarding games. We used to have effectively a huge set of books which said, this is how we want you to organise the games. And we've gone away from that. We're now using an invitation phrase. We're bringing people in and we're speaking to them so that they understand all the wrinkles before they even start. And we've removed a huge amount of the sort of regulatory framework around it. Secondly, we encourage them at the very outset to work out how the games will fit into their country and their city. We don't want people to leave white elephants. I mean, Brazil, you will be familiar with the football stadium for 40,000 people in Manaus. Doesn't even have a football team. Well, why did somebody build a 40,000 seat football stadium when there isn't a football team? So that has to be done. The legacy from London is, I think, is in two parts. Or maybe three. One is the physical legacy, because that part of London was rebuilt in a way that it would have been done eventually. It would have been done as part of the Thames Gateway development. And I remember an early meeting of the Select Committee in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, when they brought in the four chief executives of the four boroughs. And one of the questions to one of them was, why are you so keen? And he said, well, if we get the games, it'll happen faster. And I thought, this guy is smart. It happened faster. So the physical side of it is one thing. Secondly, the sporting legacy. I think one of the legacies, in fact, was the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow 2 years later. I mean, we had a memorandum of understanding with the organising committee in Glasgow, so all the problems that we encountered, they knew about almost before they started. And maybe people in Britain are crazy. They all want to turn up at 10 o'clock in the morning to watch hammer throwing in an athletic stadium. I mean, we're probably the only country in the world which fills an athletic stadium throughout an event. It was done in London and it was done in Glasgow. It's produced the 2017 World Athletics Championships. We'll come back to the Olympic Stadium. It produced the World Gymnastic Championships last year in the Hydro in Glasgow, which was the best presentation of any indoor sport I have ever seen. So there's a whole continuation of interest in sport. And then thirdly, there's the whole question of people getting up off their backsides and exercising and becoming involved in sport. That probably hasn't been as successful as any of us would have wanted to be. But it's a very good message when you're trying to organise games to inspire a generation, which we try to do. One of the other benefits has been the number of people who now volunteer to help. There are some of the London volunteers who have annual reunions. The volunteers that come to the Scottish Badminton Championships in Glasgow, some of them did the Olympic Games in London. So there's a whole raft. Rio, I just think that the legacy, first of all, in Rio is physical. There's improvement to the port. There's going to be big improvement to your transport infrastructure with the bus rapid transport system, with the metro. Please God they get it finished before the opening ceremony, otherwise it'll be quite difficult for people to get there. The village is a really good example of new housing and whatnot. So it's physical. Thereafter, there are challenges. I think you're lucky in Rio in that your mayor, Eduardo Paes, is a sports fanatic, and he will do for his city, as a result of the games, many things that you would regard as being a good legacy. Now then, Chinese one. I'm trying to.
Should athletes go to jail?
Oh, actually, criminalisation. There are 3 or 4 countries in the world which have a legislation which criminalises doping. The most recent one is Germany. I mentioned Italy earlier. They have had criminal legislation for years, but they have never once put an athlete in jail for taking drugs. the whole essence of the World Anti-Doping Code was to harmonise sanctions, and we're now up from the original sanction period of 2 years for a serious offence to 4 years. It is our belief, after taking very, very detailed and expert legal advice, that 4 years was sustainable because in law there is a concept that a sanction has to be proportionate to the offence. I mean, if you shoot somebody, the chances are you'll go to jail. If you take a banned substance, the chances are that you will be sanctioned. But in my view, you probably shouldn't go to jail. So we think, WADA believe that the sanction system which has been developed and agreed by everybody in sport should stay. If you want to criminalise issues, then you should criminalise doctors who cheat. You should criminalise coaches who administer drugs to athletes. You should get these people out of the sport, and that's fine. Criminal sanctions then as a whole basis for operation are very difficult, because my guess is that you would get a different sanction in a British court, from a different sanction in a Chinese court, from a different sanction in an American court, from a different sanction in a Japanese court. So at least the World Anti-Doping produces a harmonised system of sanctions. So we are against criminalising athletes. And I await with interest to see what happens in Germany, who are the most recent people to try to do this, that maybe they will put somebody in jail if he doesn't score a penalty kick in the final of the European Championship. So it's a tough business.